The story begins with a plane struggling through a terrifying storm. Our main character, Linda, was returning from a business trip with her colleagues. Everything seemed normal until suddenly the aircraft started shaking violently. Moments later, a massive explosion ripped through the plane. Passengers who were standing without their seatbelts were thrown around brutally. Soon after, part of the cabin burst open due to the pressure difference, and several people were sucked out into the raging wind. Amid the chaos, the manager desperately grabbed Linda's leg in an attempt to save his own life. At the same time, another man moved toward the boss, hoping for help, but the boss mercilessly pushed him toward the opening. However, as he fell, he grabbed the manager's leg, causing him to lose his balance completely. Both men were pulled out of the aircraft and disappeared into the storm. Before Linda could even process the shock, she noticed darkness closing in around her. The plane had become completely uncontrollable and was plunging straight toward the ocean. Fortunately, the angle of impact prevented the aircraft from exploding immediately, which saved Linda's life. But as seawater rapidly flooded the cabin, she quickly unfastened her seatbelt and swam out of the wreckage. Even after surviving the crash, she found no relief. She was stranded alone in the middle of an endless ocean with no sign of civilization. Then, in the distance, she spotted a small island and used every bit of strength she had left to swim toward it. By morning, she finally managed to reach the island alive. For the moment, she had escaped death. However, she had no idea that her real nightmare was only beginning. After walking a short distance, she noticed a man lying unconscious on the shore. She immediately ran toward him and discovered that it was none other than her boss, Bradley. He had also survived the crash and had been carried to the island by the waves while unconscious. Although his leg had been broken during the accident, he was the only other survivor she could find. Despite this, Linda wasn't happy to see him. In fact, he was the person she hated most in the company. Linda was the most capable employee in the strategy department. Through her hard work and dedication, she had earned the trust of her former boss and was about to be promoted to manager. But just before her promotion became official, the company's owner passed away, and his son Bradley inherited the business. The moment Bradley became the boss, he took away Linda's promotion and handed the position to one of his sycophantic friends. Not only that, but he and his friends frequently humiliated her and treated her unfairly. For a moment, Linda considered leaving him there to die. However, she thought that if she helped him survive, he might reward her by restoring her chance to become a manager, so she decided to help. She immediately picked up a sharp stone and began cutting large banana leaves. Using tree branches as support, she constructed a frame and tied leaves and twigs together with vines, creating a small shelter. Once she had protection from the sun, she focused on finding water. She dug a hole in the sand, placed coconut shells inside it, and covered the top with leaves. Soon, rain began to fall, allowing her to collect drinkable water with ease. After the rain stopped and the weather cleared, Bradley finally regained consciousness. Linda quickly approached him and gave him some water. When Bradley learned that Linda had saved his life, he awkwardly thanked her. Afterward, Linda demonstrated her survival skills by starting a fire through friction. She then managed to catch a fish and cook it. However, for Bradley, who had spent his entire life surrounded by luxury and comfort, the fish looked no better than a piece of garbage. Even so, in order to satisfy his hunger, he was forced to swallow the plain fish without any salt or spices. Unlike Bradley, Linda had no problem with the food at all. In fact, she was extremely happy despite being stranded on the island. For the first time, there was nobody around to belittle her or make her feel inferior, and she felt she could happily spend many days there. Slowly, several days passed, and the island's environment began to affect both of them in very different ways. On one hand, Linda found happiness even in the smallest things. On the other hand, Bradley desperately wanted to escape. One day, he asked her why she still hadn't created any SOS signal on the beach or made the fire larger so that someone might notice the island. According to him, that should have been her first priority, but Linda had done none of those things. This immediately made Bradley angry. He started shouting at her and sarcastically accused her of only pretending to take care of him. Even though he was completely helpless because of his broken leg, he still behaved as if all the help Linda had given him over the past several days was something he naturally deserved. Listening to his words, Linda finally realized that she would never win his respect simply by flattering him or taking care of him. He would only understand her true value when he personally experienced hardship and discomfort. With that thought in mind, Linda quietly stood up without saying a single word. She left him alone and walked away. At first, Bradley was furious about her behavior. Even after Linda left him alone, Bradley continued mocking her and complaining about her behavior. However, it didn't take long for him to realize how big a mistake he had made. Despite this realization, his pride still wouldn't let him admit it. He remained arrogant and kept waiting for Linda to return on her own. But as he waited, an entire day passed. Eventually, his pride began to break down. Yet even by nightfall, Linda had not returned. Late that night, a powerful storm swept across the island. Within a short time, the shelter that Linda had built was completely destroyed by the strong winds. The next day, the scorching sun made Bradley's condition even worse. The intense heat caused severe dehydration, and eventually, he lost consciousness. Only after Linda had let him suffer long enough did she finally return carrying water. The moment Bradley saw her, he grabbed the water and began drinking desperately without a second thought. At that point, he finally understood that he was completely dependent on Linda for survival and had no right to treat her as if she owed him anything. However, However, his attention was soon drawn to a spear that Linda was carrying. She intended to use it to hunt a dangerous wild boar. Bradley knew how deadly the animal was. Because of that, he warned Linda not to go into the jungle. He understood that if anything happened to her, his own life would be in danger as well. But Linda ignored every word he said and headed straight into the forest. As she quietly searched for her prey, the wild boar suddenly appeared and slammed into her with tremendous force, launching her into the air. Fortunately, a fallen tree happened to stand directly in the boar's path. Stopping it for a moment back on her feet, the boar was unable to launch a direct attack, which gave Linda enough time to get back on her feet and run. However, as soon as the boar caught her scent, it charged after her. Following the trail, it found nothing but pieces of torn clothing lying along the path. Before the animal could understand what was happening, Linda seized the opportunity and drove her spear deep into its body. Maddened by pain, the boar bent and broke the spear. Enraged and completely out of control, it immediately charged at her again. Faced with this deadly danger, Linda quickly raised a wooden pole in front of her. After a fierce struggle filled with screams and grunts, Linda finally managed to kill the beast. When Bradley saw the severed head of the boar, he was completely shaken. For the first time, he truly realized that Linda was incredibly dangerous, strong, and capable. From that moment on, Bradley began to fear her. A few days later, while Linda was searching the jungle for useful supplies, she discovered a waterfall where fresh, clean water could be drunk directly. For the first time since arriving on the island, she no longer had to worry about finding water. The discovery brought her a great sense of relief and happiness. However, her happiness did not last long. Suddenly, she heard the loud sound of an engine in the distance. The moment she heard it, Linda immediately ran toward the source of the noise. When she arrived, she saw a boat. The sight of it filled her eyes with hope. At last, there seemed to be a chance of rescue. But just as she was about to shout for help, she suddenly stopped. A realization struck her. If she returned to civilization, she would once again be trapped in the same exhausting and repetitive life she had always lived. She would have to work under another boss, constantly obey orders, and listen to criticism and insults every single day. But here on the island, if she chose to stay on the island, she would be the master of her own life. She wouldn't have to obey anyone, and she could do whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted. Lost in these thoughts, Linda made up her mind. She decided that she would not leave the island. So she immediately hid herself and quietly watched as the boat drifted farther and farther away until it disappeared from sight. After returning, she didn't tell Bradley anything about what had happened. However, Bradley was only following Linda's lead because he had no other choice. Deep down, he had no intention of spending the rest of his life on the island. The 2 weeks of surviving in the wilderness had changed him completely, and his patience was beginning to run out. He told Linda that they should build a raft or a boat so they could reach a vessel passing nearby and increase their chances of being seen and rescued. But the moment Linda heard his suggestion, she firmly refused. She argued that attempting such a journey would be extremely dangerous and rejected the idea of building a boat altogether. Hearing this, Bradley's anger finally exploded. Ever since they had become stranded on the island, Linda had ignored every suggestion he had made. He could no longer hold back his frustration. As a result, he decided to separate from her completely. He would build his own camp and construct a boat by himself. However, as soon as he started working alone, he realized that survival was far more difficult than he had imagined. He didn't even know the proper way to start a fire, and because of his broken leg, he couldn't travel very far. With no other option, he began collecting rainwater and coconut shells. Somehow, he managed to build a small shelter and wrote the word "help" in large letters on the sand, hoping that someone would notice it and come to rescue him. But even after 2 full days had passed, there was still no sign of help from the sea. And then hunger. Tormented by hunger, Bradley eventually became desperate enough to try eating insects he found nearby. However, the moment he put them in his mouth, he felt such intense disgust that he immediately vomited. Meanwhile, Linda had access to all kinds of delicious food, which she enjoyed comfortably without any worries. Seeing the difference between their situations completely shattered Bradley's pride. Feeling deeply ashamed, he dropped to his knees despite the pain in his injured leg and began apologizing to Linda. Linda laughed when she saw this dramatic change in his attitude and decided to accept him back into her camp. Even after experiencing such humiliation, Bradley still felt powerless inside, so he quietly waited for the right opportunity. After about half a month had passed, his physical condition began to improve. One day, Linda took him to the highest peak on the island. Reaching the summit was difficult, but the breathtaking view from the top made the effort worthwhile. Linda explained that the island's greatest danger was hidden within this beautiful-looking landscape. She then picked several berry-like fruits growing along the path and told Bradley that they contained a toxin capable of numbing the human body. To prove her point, she squeezed some of the fruit's juice onto her forearm. Within a short time, red rashes appeared on her skin. As they continued walking, Linda pointed toward a group of rocks marked in the shape of an X. She explained that everything beyond that point was covered with sharp thorns and poisonous vines. Because of the danger, she gave Bradley a strict warning. He should never go beyond that area in search of supplies. The moment Bradley heard this warning, a cunning plan began to form in his mind, and as they started making their way back, Bradley pretended to be exhausted and sat down near the poisonous fruits. As soon as he secretly picked a few of the toxic berries, the ground beneath Linda suddenly gave way and she fell into a deep pit. In reality, the surface of that area appeared solid and stable, but underneath it was completely hollow and fragile. Bradley panicked and immediately rushed to help her. He began pulling her up with all his strength. Even though he hated Linda, he couldn't bear to watch her die in such a terrible way. Eventually, thanks to his efforts, Linda's life was saved. For the first time, she began to trust Bradley without hesitation or suspicion. A few days later, a powerful storm swept across the sea. The shelter they had built near the shore was completely destroyed by the violent winds, and the situation became even worse when several trees were knocked down. Fortunately, they had already discovered a cave nearby. Without wasting any time, both of them ran to the cave and took shelter inside. By then, they were completely soaked from the rain. To protect themselves from the freezing cold, they had no choice but to remove their wet clothes and sleep close together to share body heat. Because of this growing closeness, Linda gradually started developing feelings for Bradley and eventually began to fall in love with him. Before long, Bradley became familiar with every poisonous fruit found in the jungle. Wanting to demonstrate his skills and express his gratitude to Linda, he decided that he would prepare dinner himself that night. Without thinking much about it, Linda agreed and gave him the opportunity. Surprisingly, the meal he prepared turned out to be genuinely delicious. However, the moment Linda ate a small portion of the food, she suddenly began to feel dizzy. Her vision started to blur. Linda's vision became blurry. Within moments, she could no longer keep herself upright and collapsed to the ground. But Bradley didn't even turn around to look at her. Instead, he immediately ran into the jungle. A short while later, he returned, dragging a wooden boat behind him. The truth was that Bradley had already realized that Linda never intended to let him leave the island. Because of that, he had secretly built the boat in advance. When the perfect opportunity arrived, he used some unusual berries to make Linda lose consciousness. Now, feeling victorious, he happily pushed the crude little boat into the water and headed toward the open sea without looking back. However, he had not traveled very far when a massive wave suddenly crashed into the boat and broke it apart. Before he could react, another huge wave swept him into the ocean. Fortunately, he had not drifted too far from the shore. The moment Linda regained consciousness, she immediately rushed into the water and brought him back to safety. As soon as Bradley woke up, he panicked and began desperately apologizing to her, but Linda said nothing. Instead, she silently handed him a cooked crab. Without thinking twice, Bradley ate it. However, only a short time later, he began feeling very unusual, and he couldn't understand what was happening. That was when Linda finally revealed the truth. She explained that the crab had come into contact with a highly dangerous sea creature, causing Bradley to temporarily lose control of his movements. Actually, she did all of this to teach Bradley an important lesson. After that, she picked up a knife and prepared a dramatic prank. Slowly, she moved closer to Bradley and hinted at what she was about to do next. Seeing this, Bradley became completely terrified. Then, all of a sudden, Linda made her move, and Bradley was convinced that something terrible had happened. Moments later, Linda started laughing and revealed the truth. What she had cut prize wasn't part of Bradley at all. It was just a rat. She had staged the entire scene simply to frighten Bradley so that he would never behave that way again. Her clever trick completely shattered Bradley's arrogance, and from that moment on, he obeyed everything she said without question. However, Linda wasn't able to enjoy this control for very long. One day, while she was searching for supplies, she suddenly heard the sound of an engine in the distance once again. This time, the person approaching had already spotted her. As the boat came closer, Linda realized that it was none other than Bradley's fiancée, Jenny. In fact, even though the rescue team had given up hope, Jenny never did. She had continued searching the area for Bradley, and now her search had finally come to an end. Forcing a smile onto her face, Linda greeted Jenny as if she were genuinely happy to see her. Then, with no other choice, she informed Jenny that Bradley was still alive. But deep inside, Linda still wasn't willing to leave the island. Linda still didn't want to leave the island. However, Jenny had now discovered that both she and Bradley were alive. The only people who knew this truth were Jenny and the guide who had accompanied her. Because of that, Linda secretly made a dangerous decision. She lied and claimed that she knew a shortcut, then began leading them in that direction. After a while, she brought them to the edge of a dangerous cliff, the very same place where she had nearly lost her own life. Then, pretending to tie her shoelaces, she told the other two to go ahead without her. The moment Jenny stepped forward, the ground suddenly gave way beneath her, and she began falling straight down. In reality, this had all been part of Linda's plan to get rid of both of them. But by sheer luck, only Jenny became trapped, while the guide remained alive. At that moment, Linda found herself lost in thought, unsure of what she should do next. Sometime later, she returned to Bradley alone, and what had happened to the other two would soon be revealed. After returning from the cliff, Linda was falling apart inside. She couldn't believe what she had done. Just then, Bradley approached her and asked her to come into the jungle to look for food. However, Linda refused outright, pretending that she wasn't feeling well. Seeing an opportunity, Bradley picked up a knife and headed into the jungle without saying another word. Once inside the forest, he decided to hunt for food. After tracking through the jungle for some time, Bradley spotted a small wild boar. He slowly moved closer to it, but in the very next moment, his eyes suddenly fell on the ground. The truth was that right where the boar had been digging through the soil, a human hand was sticking out of the earth. As soon as Bradley got closer and took a better look, he was completely shocked. That hand belonged to his own fiancée. The ring on the finger was the very same one he had placed on her hand during their engagement. The moment this truth came to light, Bradley's anger became uncontrollable and he immediately rushed back toward Linda. As soon as Linda saw him running in her direction, she became nervous for a moment. Holding up the ring, Bradley demanded to know why she had done it. The instant Linda saw the ring, she understood everything. Trying to protect herself, she claimed that it had all been an accident, but Bradley didn't believe a single word she said. Realizing that the situation was quickly getting worse, Linda slowly moved her hand toward her waist. However, Bradley had already stolen the knife. Seeing this, Linda panicked and immediately began running deeper into the jungle. Bradley took off after her without hesitation. When Linda realized that she had no way left to escape, she quickly came up with a new plan. At that very moment, Bradley spotted her shadow behind a tree. But when he reached the spot, all he found were the shoes she had left behind. The shoelaces were missing, which instantly made him feel that something was wrong. Suddenly, Linda lunged at him from behind and wrapped the shoelaces tightly around his neck, making it extremely difficult for him to breathe. Bradley used all of his strength to break free, but Linda refused to loosen her grip. During the struggle, the knife slipped from Bradley's hand and fell to the ground. Using the last of his strength, Bradley grabbed Linda by the hair, spun her around, and slammed her onto the ground. He then climbed on top of her and pushed her face into the mud, trying to overpower her completely. At that moment, Linda managed to seize an opportunity and grab the knife. When she wiped the dirt from her eyes and looked again, Bradley was nowhere to be seen. In reality, he was heading toward the same dangerous area that Linda had repeatedly warned him to avoid. Seeing this, Linda chose not to follow him and quietly returned on her own. Even after running a considerable distance, nothing happened to Bradley, but the moment he looked ahead, he was left stunned. Nestled between two massive cliffs stood a luxurious villa. The sight immediately made him realize that this was not an abandoned island at all. It was someone's private island. Filled with a renewed sense of hope, Bradley rushed toward the villa and began shouting for help. However, no one responded from inside. That was when he noticed that the front door was already open. The moment he stepped inside, Bradley quickly switched on the lights and began searching every corner for anything useful. Then his eyes landed on a refrigerator. As soon as he opened it, he found it stocked with a variety of modern drinks. Exhausted and desperately thirsty, Bradley immediately grabbed a bottle of water and started drinking. But then everything suddenly changed. For reasons he couldn't understand, Linda's voice suddenly echoed through the speakers. And the moment he heard what she was saying, the entire truth finally began to unfold before him. He finally realized that the entire story about the dangerous toxic area had been a lie, created solely to keep him away from this place. Now, without any hesitation, Linda revealed the whole truth. In reality, the ship he had spotted when she first arrived on the island came every month to deliver supplies, and it was through that ship that she discovered the luxurious villa. After finding the place, she secretly learned the access code and, at the right opportunity, made the villa her own private refuge. Fortunately for her, the real owner rarely visited the island. As a result, she was able to clean everything up before each visit and continue living there comfortably without attracting any suspicion. Everything had been going exactly according to her plan. However, Jenny's unexpected arrival ruined everything. As events spiraled out of control, Linda found herself making a decision she had never originally intended to make. Hearing this shocking truth sent chills down Bradley's spine. Even after searching desperately through the darkness, he was unable to locate the control room. Then suddenly, the situation changed completely. Linda herself arrived at the villa while searching for him. In fact, she had already managed to obtain a hunting rifle from inside the house. The moment Bradley saw her, he immediately dropped to his knees and began begging for his life. He promised that he would never try to escape again, and that he would stay on the island with her forever. Not only that, but he also confessed that during all the time they had spent together, he had genuinely fallen in love with her. To convince Linda that he was telling the truth, he began reminding her of all the beautiful moments they had shared together. As Bradley continued talking, Linda began to feel that something wasn't right. Then her eyes suddenly fell on the mounted bull's head behind him. One of its horns was missing. In that instant, she realized what was happening. Without wasting a second, Linda grabbed a nearby golf club. At the same time, Bradley managed to get hold of the rifle. However, the moment he pulled the trigger, nothing happened. The gun was empty. In reality, this had all been part of Linda's carefully prepared plan from the very beginning. In the next moment, she swung the golf club and launched a fierce attack on Bradley. A final, powerful blow brought the confrontation to an end, and with that, the story reached its conclusion. Afterward, Linda carefully cleaned up the entire villa and presented herself as the sole survivor of the island's tragic events. She then shared the incident with the world as an incredible survival miracle. The story captured public attention, making her widely known. Over time, her fame continued to grow, and she eventually became extremely wealthy.